Hello and welcome back to Around the Horns. I have a special episode today with my good friends Dustin McComas and Drew Bishop of Five Tool. Gents, appreciate having y'all on again. It's good to see y'all. Glad y'all have been surviving the summer heat and circuit.
Yeah, I might have a little bit more tan than maybe some people are used to after we were spending a lot of days in Melissa, Texas. Drew far more than I, and some time down in Katy and Houston, and then into the summer out at area code in San Diego, where it's, don't get us wrong, it's picturesque. It is amazing weather, but you get down to that bowl at USD and that sun beats on you and there are no clouds in the sky. It can wear on you a little bit. So we're good. We were talking off air about getting the kids back into the school and things like that. So yeah, it's like we get off the summer grind and our wives are like, here.
Yeah. Here's your list.
Take the 3-year-old, take the 1-year-old or almost 1-year-old. Like this is your job now.
Here's your list. Yeah, like Dustin said, that don't be fooled by the San Diego part of our trip. Like that facility, that stadium is hot. And the way they split it this year, they did the underclassmen first and the upperclassmen, and during the underclassmen, it's mostly college coaches, right? Because a lot of the pro guys haven't migrated onto that class yet, and we were just, I know I was determined to like stick it out. We had a good spot right behind home plate, had a good little group of scouts and coaches right around there to talk to every day. So you just kind of went and put your stuff down at 8 a.m. and we're ready to go for the next 4 games. And we're getting out of there about 8 o'clock at night and like just roasting because that sun just hits you and there's no breeze. And then, but for the upperclassmen, I gave in, and some of the pro guys started rolling in, and we have relationships with a lot of those guys, and our resident Longhorn in the scouting world, who wears Longhorn gear out while working sometimes for the Mariners. That all the pro guys had huge tents down the third base line. So when the Texas team wasn't playing, I gave in and found some shade with some of the Mariners guys for a little bit. So that was nice. But
Smart choices.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. Well, again, thank y'all for being on. For those that don't know Dustin and Drew, right? I assume everyone does, but they work for Five Tool, right? They're helping kids stay in the game longer. They're helping them get recognition for their play. And can y'all dive in a little bit further about what Five Tool is and what it does?
Yeah, I think generally that's, I don't know if we have an official mission statement, but it's really, the genesis of the company was to help kids get exposure and, keep kids in the game longer and give them opportunities by covering them and their performance and the games a little bit differently, with the social media component and the video component, but really just creating, these opportunities for kids to stay more regional and play in first class events and tournaments, and creating a kind of a one-stop shop opportunity for college coaches in the region, because generally speaking, a lot of these guys are not going to leave very far from home to go play college baseball if they're fortunate to. And a lot of these coaches aren't going to leave the region to go find players for the most part. So that was kind of the genesis of it, and, creating the types of events that really put the player first in their experience and their coverage, and creating opportunities for them. And also too, Drew and I have had a lot of fun, with the podcasts, with, player rankings, with kind of adding that sort of component to, the evaluation stuff, in addition to, the great events and the great tournaments that go in the fall and summer, really almost all year round besides the winter. But really it's about the players and creating an experience for them that's both enjoyable and also is going to help give them exposure opportunities to just stay in the game. Because we're big believers in, stay in the game. Who knows? You keep playing. Maybe you're a coach. Maybe you end up being a scout. Maybe you end up being a summer coach a high school coach, an instructor, or whatever it is. It's just, it can really give you so many opportunities to kind of stay in the game and help shape lives and do it the right way.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought up the podcast. I was very excited. I mean, obviously it's good to see David Pierce, head coach of UT, on the other day, but I was really excited that y'all had Alan Yeager, because he literally wrote the Bible around arm care. And so it was good to hear him talk. And I think I mentioned on Twitter, like, everyone should be listening to that. It doesn't matter what age or what rank or file you're at within the baseball game, but that was really good stuff. But yeah, so jumping in, I wanted to put y'all on a spot. Now, y'all seen a lot of kids, y'all been on the circuit, and wanted to talk about kind of that post MLB draft. We're getting ready for school fall ball, the 2023 class for Texas, and what it shaped out to be, and what kind of y'all have seen from this group.
Yeah. I think, we we talked a little bit offline about talking about the importance of the roster construction and how it's kind of different, and it's gone some different paths over the last couple of years with the introduction of the portal. And I think that's one thing you really have to consider when looking at the roster and who you're bringing in. I know Coach Pierce, when he first got to Texas, was really big on putting together a roster, not just assembling talent. And and depending upon how you show up to a place, that can be different and take different amounts of time based on what you're left with. And it took a couple of years, and I think Coach Pierce and Sean Allen and that whole group did a really good job of finally getting to a place where you could recruit to need and recruit pieces to fit what you're potentially or probably losing. And so I think that's one thing that a lot of people don't necessarily understand, or just don't have the amount of information when they're looking at what people are expecting to happen in the draft and who's available. And the other part of it too is that it's a puzzle piece. Every kid's a puzzle piece, and how they fit in with the scholarship money, the NIL portion that's been introduced now. It makes that all different. And it's not as simple as in football. You are going up against competitors offering the same thing, right? It's not a full ride for every kid. And some families have to view the recruiting process completely different than others. And as a result, that's what makes the baseball recruiting tricky. And on top of having the draft on the front end and the back end, meaning guys that you've recruited that are coming to school, and then who you're going to lose. I know you'd see a lot of people frustrated with, what seemed at times like a lack of activity in the portal this year. But a lot of that was just because, we thought we had a really good chance to get LeBaron back, to get Tanner back. And so, there wasn't the available money or spots or, to promise out that to allow you to go chasing after some of these big fish in the portal. Not to say we didn't, because I think, but it was targeted. It wasn't just like, hey, here's a good play over here, let's go get him. You have to take into account how that's going to fit into the roster. But, looking at that 23 group, there's several guys that Dustin and I like a lot and have seen a lot. There's a lot of out-of-state flavor that we haven't gotten to see quite as much, but we did get to see some of those guys at area code over the past. And, guys like Casey Borba come in with a big reputation. And obviously his dad being a prominent coach on the West Coast, you kind of know what you're getting with him. As an advanced player, Will Gasparino is another one from outside of Texas that, realistically, we had to sweat in the draft quite a bit, with his ties to pro baseball, with his dad being the scouting director of the Dodgers. That's, he had a real upfront look, and the family obviously has a good understanding of how the draft and pro ball works. But, I know that for them specifically, I know Tulo being a part of it was a big deal. And, once they knew that was going to happen, I mean, the timing of figuring out that Tulo was going to be involved was crucial in a decision like that for him specifically, and probably some other kids as well. But and I'll let Dustin touch on some of the in-state guys. I know because we do the rankings and we have most of these guys placed, but just looking at the roster, it's deep. I know we'll get into some of that, but where these guys fit in and what their trajectory is going to be over the next couple of years, there's going to be some guys that are going to end up, we think being really good players for us, but you may not see it this year just based on what's back, which is a good problem to have. And then the trick becomes keeping them engaged, in the portal era. It's a different world, and you now have to, for whatever reason, or I mean, I guess we know the reason, but for lack of a better term, just making sure that you almost have to keep that in mind or recruit them or be recruiting them all the time. I mean, it's just because there's people in their ear, whether you want to believe it or not, there's going to be, whether it's parents, agents, teammates that they grew up playing with, like, it's a different world than it used to be. And it's just something that you have to take into account, and, something that the staff is going to have to be on top of, or, it could be an issue, not saying it's going to be, but, there's certainly some circumstances where some of these guys are good players and they may not be playing day one. And, I know there's people that all around the country that roster watch and box score watch, I guess, better term, to see who's playing and who's not early on. And then that's when it starts a lot of the time. So, but yeah, I'll let Dustin touch on some of the guys out of Texas, but that's kind of wanted to touch on the roster building component of it a little bit before we started getting into specific names.
Yeah, and to add to that too, I think people need to look, think of the scholarship limit, and then think of, you have to understand how much of your resources are allocated to certain positions. Like, we talk to college, recruiting coordinators and coaches all the time, and I'll bring up guys to coaches in the summer and say, hey man, that you're looking for this or that. Is like, I've already got X amount of scholarship money tied up in the outfielders. I can't take anymore. Like, it'd be nice to grab all these really, really talented guys, but you have to look at your available scholarships and then look at your roster, and then you've got to allocate your resources to a way to where you're not hanging yourself out to dry. Like, you've got to make sure you've got quality catching in depth. I think that's something that Texas learned a few years ago when they're literally asking a guy that was back as just a student to come catch a midweek game because they just the Michael McCann year when he got hurt and all those injuries just wrecked the position. So you got to make sure you have your catching depth. And I think you see now that there's been a lot of dedication to athleticism in middle of the diamond players, because, you might bring in 3 shortstops and, not all those guys are going to play shortstop, but that guy can play second, that guy can play third, maybe that guy can play center field. Dylan Campbell arrived in Texas as a second baseman, ended up being a guy that was a really, really good corner outfielder. So you see a lot of, dedication to the middle of the diamond type of players, because they can kind of fan out and profile at different positions, as opposed to, loading up on a bunch of corner infielders to where if they don't hit, you're kind of left, in a tough situation. But, I think you've seen Texas over recent years. I think they've done a really good job on the position player side, specifically in the last 2 classes. When you look at the guys they've brought in with, the Jalen Floreses, the Jared Thomases, the Jane Duplantiers, the Max Balloos, and guys like that. And credit to them. Like, I think that's one thing that Texas has been really good at for a long, long time, is that typically guys don't want to leave Texas when they get there. I mean, it goes back to, Augie before, and Pierce as well. Like, I'm sure there are plenty of freshmen this year that had people in their ears, like you were saying, like, oh, you can come here and play and do this and that or whatever. But, those guys went out and had, a lot of them had really good summers. Are going to come back and compete for a spot. So I think they've done a really good job with their position player depth. But I think fans got to think about, okay, like if you're, building a roster, you have to understand where your resources are allocated, because you don't want to get overextended in one area, because it's really tough to kind of fill that gap. But with the in-state players, obviously Sikora, I think people knew that he was very, very likely to go to draft. Yeah. Drew mentioned Gasparino and Borba. I mean, Gasparino's got really high level tools. He's the type of guy that typically you see signed because it's tools, it's projection, it's performance. Like it checks a lot of boxes, and typically those types of guys don't end up in college. So he's got really, really good upside. On the mound, I think they're going to have some guys that are candidates that kind of come in and compete initially. I don't know about starters per se right away, but guys like Hudson Hamilton, good makeup, is going to throw a lot of strikes, can spin the baseball. Easton Tumis, a guy that's got a good slider. His stuff really ticked up at the end of the spring. He was throwing hard again. That could be a kind of guy that profiles in your bullpen. Big Hayden Morris had some injury issues throughout the year, but man, when he's right, the stuff is really, really good. Just a really big, imposing physical presence. One of the best right-handed curveballs in the state. It's a definite swing and miss out pitch. That's a guy that, fully healthy can come into your bullpen and give you a big presence out of there. Just gonna, hey man, we're gonna give you 2 innings. Air it out for 2 innings. Yeah. Get a couple strikeouts, put you back in the dugout, hand the ball off to somebody else. So I think that position player wise, they've bring in guys like Lane Allen. D. Kennedy is another one of those middle of the diamond types of athletes with a really good right-handed swing. Nick Sanders. I don't think long-term he's going to be a catcher. I think that he's probably going to be a guy you see in the corner outfield spot probably, but man, the right-handed swing, the torque, the bat speed, the power. I mean, it's a really pretty picturesque kind of operation in the batter's box. He's got some real hitting talent. MJ Sweeney is just like a guy with a pedigree. Obviously, his dad being a longtime major league player. I think one of the smartest things you can do is bet on sons of former big leaguers. He's going to be a big physical potential power presence. It's good to have, I think, 1 or 2 of those guys in your class that kind of those potential middle of the order type of boppers, and then kind of, okay, let's get our athleticism and our stuff in our other spots. So it's the position player side. If you start to look at their 23 class and their 22 class, I mean, it's in really, really good shape. There's going to be a lot of competition in the fall. I think it's when you start looking at the arms, it's like, okay, they're going to need some of these freshmen, I think, to give them some innings just to kind of help elevate the stuff. Specifically in the bullpen to give them some depth there and then kind of ease those guys. And we see it all the time. Sometime a guy starts out in the bullpen, then he's a midweek guy, and all of a sudden you're like, oh man, Pete Hansen was kind of like this. I think Lucas Gordon was kind of like this. It's like, man, this guy's a midweek starter. He's getting a lot of outs. Let's see what happens in the weekend. And all of a sudden those guys can kind of take off. So they do have some of those candidates, but I don't think there's any of those guys are going to show up and be like, oh my gosh, we've just got to figure out a way to get this guy into a weekend rotation right away. So, which is a good thing. Those guys need some time to grow into their roles on the mound.
Yeah. That was one of my questions. I have a particular favorite, or not favorite, but I think I know who I would pick out of the most college arm ready, right? I would go with Hayden Morris just because of the physical presence, the ability to throw downhill. He's got a pretty clean delivery. You said the injury issues, but I mean, out of the arms coming in, including maybe even Cole Selvig, the kid out of Wisconsin, who do you think is the most college ready arm to come in and provide some relief out of the bullpen and get that kind of first look?
To me, we've both been fans of Hudson Hamilton for a long time, just because of the strike throwing ability and the competitiveness. For what it appears like the team's going to need, at least early on, I think his profile fits really well. Kind of a middle relief. They're going to have to sort out what goes on in the bullpen. And a lot of times that takes time. Obviously not a freshman, but that the grabbing Will Mercer from Notre Dame will, I think, he's a guy that, you always hate to see this situation, like when you're like one piece away from really like locking something down. And then sure enough, that guy's on the next year's team. Like he's out there ready to go. But I think that was a sneaky, huge get for us. I think he's got a chance to really, really play a huge role on this year's team, likely somewhere late in the bullpen. But, and that role that Tanner Witt served as a freshman, kind of being that bridge guy, like that killed us this past year, like that was tough. And, I think that, I could see Hudson being in a slot like that. It'll be interesting. Like, you mentioned Morris and like Dustin said, like when the stuff is right and he's healthy, like he might end up being the best one out of the group. But the adjustment a lot of times for high school kids going to college isn't the stuff. It's the other stuff. It's, hey, can he fill this position? Can he hold runners? And if he's going to be used as a bullpen type guy, like that becomes even more important. So, not to, I haven't seen him throw recently enough to say, but I mean, like you can feel, I mean, he kind of fits that mold of some of those really big pitchers that Coach Pierce had when he was at Rice.
Yeah.
And I know Coach Pierce likes some guys with size, but he also likes guys that have a lot of athleticism. He talked about that on the podcast with Alan Yeagers. He doesn't necessarily love the idea of a PO just strictly because some of them have started going away from being athletic. It's not to denigrate being a PO, but like if you're going to be a PO, don't lose your athleticism. That was kind of his big push when we talked to him with Alan Yeager the other day. But Hudson Hamilton, just everything Bulldog, that kind of mentality is what you hear a lot when his name is brought up. And I could just see his profile being a guy that can be that huge piece, being that bridge guy. I like a lot of what we've heard. I don't know a whole lot about George Zaharias, but another guy, Gage Bain, and Gage has an interesting story and background. Like he was committed to us out of high school, it feels like 5 years ago. Seriously, might have been 5 years ago, but then he had an arm injury, ended up decommitting, has had a roundabout path, has been at several different schools, a couple different JUCOs, and has found his way back here. And I mean, the stuff is real. He's a guy that he could be called upon in a late inning role that could end up being huge. Like there's a lot of that there wasn't the huge fish, so to speak, that came from the portal this year, but there's some really sneaky pieces that could play huge roles for the team this year. And, I think that that's something that goes overlooked a lot. And the staff did a good job in the portal and grabbing some of these guys late to kind of fit what we knew we were going to need.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned George. I was talking to Rob out in NorCal, and I said, "Hey, what's the deal with Zaharias?" I was like, "No one talks about the guy. He's not on social media. Like, you don't see him at camps and all that." And he goes, "Read the clippings, man. He went out and struck 17 out the other day coming off an injury. Like, they've had them on a super strict regimen with pitch counts. He doesn't really get to play a lot of the big games because of that." He's like, he's a guy that, maybe a year or two, if he sticks with it in the program, is someone that really surprises. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, good to know. I hadn't heard anything about the guy. So
the California guys, we talk about it like it's a different social media presence out there. Like a lot of those guys, like even the top end guys, like, Rafi Velasquez, who got drafted in the first round, I don't even think had a Twitter account, it's different out there. It's way, way different.
Yeah.
Some of those guys just don't have the massive following or even care about social media. So sometimes it's like, what's up with this guy? And it's like, oh, he's really good. He just doesn't ever get on Twitter or Instagram or anything else. Like you guys both said, I think Morris in terms of pure stuff is the guy, but Hamilton from a strike throwing makeup. And, I heard he had a little tendonitis during the high school season and came back. And I heard he was up to 95 at some point. He's always been able to really spin the baseball. And I think that he's one of those guys that I like guys like that throw strikes and spin the baseball, because when they get to college, sometimes it's as simple as a tweak of a pitch grip or just understanding what their arsenal needs to look like and how to make it work. It can kind of unlock a different level of performance. But Morris with pure stuff is gonna really stand out. I mean, it's big time pure stuff. But I think Hamilton, like Drew said, the makeup, the strike throwing, the bulldog mentality. I remember when he committed, talking to some people, and people raved about just the presence. And I saw him in high school. I mean, Yeah. He gets out there and it's fearless. It's attacking. I'm going to come at you. I'm going to throw strikes. I'm going to set the tone. Not in like a bravado, loud kind of way, but just carries himself a little differently than most guys.
Yeah. What have y'all seen from Easton Toomas? I know he was a kid that had a lot of helium maybe a year ago last summer. And, I think he had a little shoulder injury or just had to sit out for a little bit, but his velo dipped. What have y'all seen from him on the circuit or, just in high school in general?
Yeah, I actually saw him at the event that ended up him flipping to Texas because Coach Pierce was there as well last summer at the Texas Scouts Association All-Star game. He was up to 94 with a really good slider, like 84, 85, spin, shape, swing and miss. I mean, it was a dynamite pitch. Ended up coming to Texas after that. And he's a guy that entered the spring with a lot of scouting attention. Like guys are going in to see him, as a potential pro guy. And he's I think we have him listed at 6'3", 150. I don't know if that's accurate, but I'd say he's probably like 170, but he's a thin guy. And that's one of the things scouts are like, hey, he's coming out.
He's listed on the fall roster at 6'4", 165.
Okay. And I think that's accurate. Like, that's one of the things is like, scouts are kind of wondering, hey, is he going to add some mass? Is there going to be some more strength? Because, that's if you're going to be profiled as a starter, those sorts of things are important. And he came out of the gates a little bit slow, but from talking to scouts and some people by the end of the spring, he was turning some heads again. He was really throwing well in the playoffs. So I think the fastball slider combo alone is going to give him a chance to be a guy that could be an instant impact kind of guy out of the bullpen.
Yeah.
Because if you say, hey, short burst, he should be I think a 92, 94, who knows with the college, fall, what that looks like in the spring, but 92, 94 with a slider that's going to get out. It was one of the better sliders in the state.
So he just needs to live with Matt Couch and take his
training. Yeah. And in some of those guys, like there's only so much they can add. They're just not,
Yeah.
But one thing too, like Coach Pierce talks about, like, don't lose that free flowing and the athleticism and those things like that. And I think that's going to be a guy that they like in that regard.
You spoke about D Kennedy and just, we know how athletic the kid is. He moved over to Prestonwood. What did y'all see from him this past spring in terms of growth and maturity, being on a team that's a little different makeup than what he's played on in the past?
Yeah. So I got to see D several times. I mean, he's got some juice and like he's strong. He's like really strong hands, athletic, good arm strength. I mean, a couple of times I saw him, he got off on the mound and was, throwing in the 90s. So there's some real arm strength there. Be interesting to see what he could go the Dylan Campbell route to where he starts somewhere in the middle infield and then eventually goes to the outfield. But he may hit enough to find his way, just to be one of those guys where you got to find a spot for him, and just hit his way into the lineup. But, if there's one thing that they're going to have to pay attention to and probably work on some is he did strike out a lot, especially for the level of competition that he was playing. But he's a hitter. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Like when he hits it, it's different. And he was one of the few hitters in the DFW area last year that there was a consistent amount of pro scouts there. Right. So that tells you something. Right. And he's a guy that they were at least paying attention to, but he's strong. Like he's very compact. He's very strong. I mean, he reminds you a lot of Dylan. I mean, to be honest, at that age, they both had some hitter in them. I think Dylan had a little bit better contact skills, but D may have a little bit more juice at that age than Dylan did. But a really good player, a guy that was an A&M commit at one point, and kind of, I guess, that changed whenever they brought in the new staff. But definitely a good get. Sounds like from everything early on, they haven't done anything official yet, but he's been impressive so far, just out there messing around with the guys and hitting and stuff. So, but there's a lot of potential there. The biggest question for me is where he's going to end up. Like I said, I think he'll start out in the infield. And what he plays this year might be completely different than where he eventually ends up down the road. But exciting player, good player. And if they can find a way to cut down on the strikeouts, I think he's going to have a really good career at Texas.
Yeah. Speaking of makeup and, recruiting middle of the infield, Sam Ardoin, Sai's little brother. What have y'all seen from him? I mean, I feel like the last 2 times I've seen him hit, he's shown a lot more maturity, a lot more strength in hand, just like in the glide path, better than he has in the past, maybe where he wasn't as advanced or wasn't as mature in his body. So,
yeah, Sam's super athletic, and coming from that family, you're going to be a baseball player. Yeah. So like that's a key thing. Like he might be one of those guys that like I always thought that in every single class there was always one guy that not really, it's tough to come out of nowhere if you're a Texas recruit, but let's just call it come out of nowhere and be a guy, maybe just a guy that you're not expecting to be a dude right away, right off the bat. And with his baseball background and, adding some strength, he could be that kind of guy. I mean, he's a good baseball player. And, I think that's the one thing to look at with him. The opportunity is going to probably be the biggest thing for him. Is he going to, with what they've got on the roster and all that, like that'll probably be the biggest thing. So we may not find out this year, but I'm pretty confident to say that the kid's going to be a baseball player just because of his dad, his brother, and where he's come from. So yeah, he's one that probably gets overlooked on paper some. He's not from Texas. He's not in the state that's as publicly known as some of the other bigger states out there that are covered, I guess is a better term for it. But I can't imagine Sam not being a good player for Texas at some point. Kind of like maybe like a Josh Prince, if you remember him. Yeah. He ended up playing the big leagues, younger brother of a former Texas player from Louisiana also. So there's a lot of similarities there, but I haven't gotten to see him play in person a whole lot, but I think you can feel pretty confident that he's going to be a good baseball player.
Yeah. Dustin, staying in the kind of the Central Texas area, Austin, a kid that has some injury issues, has focused on football previously, but now is a baseball only guy, Blake Peterson out of Westlake. He's a kid that multiple times I saw that can really hit the ball, but what does that kind of projection look like for his bat in the college game? Maybe being a corner outfielder.
Yeah, he's got the ability to impact the baseball. I mean, it's not just a contact based type of thing. He can actually drive the baseball. He's always been a guy that's had good feel for the barrel and an ability to get the barrel to the baseball and create that sort of extra base impact. And he's kind of we talk about Sam is a guy that kind of enters with not a very for lack of a word, a famous guy, even though his his brother was a star at Texas and is hammering the ball in the minor leagues right now. Blake's kind of like that, I think, too. Maybe a little overlooked. Like you said, he just hasn't had that fully healthy season at Westlake the last couple of years. But I think he's going to be a physical right-handed hitter. I think there's going to be the barrel feels there. It's natural. And he's going to be a guy that I think, get into a college program, strength and conditioning program, like all that sort of stuff. I think he's got a chance to kind of unlock some things. And, he profiles as an outfielder, corner outfielder, probably be known for the bat and not so much the glove. But, he can hit. And, once upon a time, when you started naming right-handed hitters in the state of Texas, he was one of the first few guys you mentioned, just because he always just would hammer the ball. Yeah. Just kind of that innate ability to really get the barrel to it and drive it. So he's certainly got a chance. And I'm excited to follow his development, because I think that there's still a lot in there that we haven't quite seen the last couple of seasons, because there's a lot of talent. And I think this just kind of a new environment, new strength and conditioning, all that sort of stuff could be really good for him.
Yeah, makes sense. Up in the greater Dallas area, Drew, what have you mentioned him previously, Lane Allen? He's a kind of a more bigger bodied shortstop in high school. does he? I assume he doesn't stay middle of the park, right? He's probably going to shift one side or the other. Or what have y'all
Yeah,
seen?
I just this he played shortstop at a pretty high level this past year. I think as he continues to grow, his body is just going to take him to one of the corner spots. But there's been times where you see him that he's one of the best hitters in the state. Big physical presence. At one of our biggest events, not this summer but last summer, he hit a huge, like massive home run, and probably the biggest game from a fan / scouting presence we maybe have ever had. He was facing, like, his team, they had Barrett Kent, and they were facing the really good 12 team up in Melissa. And it was one of the deals where all the pro guys were there. All the teams that were in the event stuck around to see that game, because it was the two clear best teams in the summer that year going head to head. And they had a stretch where it was within a 10-minute span, there was several lead changes, multiple home runs. It was one of the more memorable amateur games I've ever seen. And he was the one that had the biggest moment of the entire game, and they ultimately ended up winning that game. But there's a lot there. It sounds like he's in that group with D. Kennedy of guys that have impressed early on. And so, I think it'll be interesting to see how big he gets, because he's got a frame where he can carry a lot more weight, but still stay athletic. That's the thing is, I could see, if he could be a guy that ends up being your, long-term third baseman, he could potentially be a big time middle of the order guy. He's one of those guys that some of the bigger guys with his frame have a tough time being consistent at that age. So there's been some spurts where he hasn't, where he hasn't been as good as others, but when he's good, he's definitely in contention for one of the best right-handed hitters in the state for sure.
Yeah. I thought him coming out of his junior to senior year, he got a little, you don't typically see this, you usually see the opposite, but I thought he got a little bit more fluid, a little bit more you usually see guys kind of he's stiffer, type deal. And I actually thought he kind of went the other way. But he's routinely made quality contact a lot. You look at his 5-tool profile, it's loaded with early high school season, playoffs, summer league. He's hit a lot last year. And, like Drew said, I think that he's a great example of a guy that can kind of grow into a third base to where he's got that sort of ability to carry some more weight and also profile at that position and also profile in the middle of your lineup down the road.
Yeah. That was the one thing I had always noticed. I remember that highlight you're talking about, because when he hit it, the whole stadium went bananas. But
it was blasted.
Yeah, he destroyed that thing. But yeah, that was always my concern with him, is just where does he end up with that projection, because he does have that bigger frame. And so staying at third base.
I will say, again, Tulo likes big shortstops, so we can't discount that either. Having been a decent one himself. If there's a chance that Lane can stick, you feel pretty confident that there's a guy in the building that knows what that's supposed to look like. I think that may be a thing they figure out pretty quick, or they give him more of a chance there than we would assume. But like I said, he played a high level shortstop for Geyer this year on a team that went really deep. So you never know. Nobody thought that Trey Faltine was going to play shortstop when he showed up at Texas either. So, luckily it's nice to have a former Gold Glove winner in the building. That I think he'll have a pretty good idea of what should be done there. So feel pretty confident with that. But
a kid that's out of state. So I wanted to touch on two others before we come back for kind of one of the late additions to the class. But Ian Check, his obviously got a lot of family ties with his sister having played for Texas and Estelle. But from everything I've seen from him, he's done really well. I think one of maybe the worry is competition, but he's done well at some of the bigger events too, up in the Midwest. I don't know how much y'all have seen of him, but from a bat and perspective and everything, what are y'all's thoughts?
I haven't seen a whole lot, but I would say competition wise, we're starting to see over time that it's starting to get real in some of those areas in terms of some of the talent that comes out of there. It kind of used to be like, these guys were kind of unicorns and how talented were they? But you go up to area code, and I think the two best teams for both the underclass and the upper class were the Midwest and the Northeast. And so if you go up there and you perform, chances are you're going to be just fine going anywhere and doing your thing.
Yeah. Like talking about like piggybacking off what Dustin said there. I mean, I like that the Midwest team this year at area code was the best team in the upperclassmen. And, it's going to speak a lot to the development, like having a kid like him, who's 6'4", 210, a big right-handed hitter. Again, like having a guy like Tulo in the building is like, that's a good thing for someone like that. And, it'll be interesting because, for a long time, that part of the country wasn't paid a whole lot of attention to for that reason. Like, there was a question about the competition. You didn't get to see them a lot, but now, like, I think Vanderbilt was one of the first ones to start really doing it, but them more so the Northeast than the Midwest. But man, there's a couple of teams that like Louisville is a team that has been just destroying Chicago. Like they have a lot of really good players from the Chicago area, and they're there. I mean, and it takes may take a little bit of dreaming or some projection of what the development can be, and has to take some belief in what your development system is. But he's a guy, like it's kind of like you've seen with the football team. They started taking all these, when Mac was here, we took all the Texas kids, and that was just, that's it. That's all we did. And, there's some real growing narrative that, while they may be really good in high school, there's a question about how much better they're going to get because they've had the good coaching. They've played against the good competition, so they may be closer to a finished product when they show up, and that there may be some truth to that for baseball as well. I mean, not necessarily saying that the Texas kids aren't going to develop, but you do see, there's a greater potential for some of these kids to come in and really make a jump because of the things that we talked about. They haven't played as much because of the weather. They may not have played the competition, and they ultimately may not be able to do it. But at the same time, they might be a guy that gets in that system and gets with the program that we're running, and they just absolutely take off. So he'll be one that'll be an interesting storyline to follow. But 6'4", 210, I mean, that isn't too dissimilar from what Tulo is, and like it's and that's something that people I think discount too. Like there's different types of swings for guys with different body types, and so again, having a guy like that about that same size in the building can be a real big part of development. So like I said, like Dustin said, we haven't seen him a lot, but you can at least kind of hang your hat on the potential of that profile and how it's played out over the last couple of years across the country.
Yeah, he's a kid that I feel like he doesn't have the fastest hands, but he's one of those guys, kind of like DC, that just knows how to keep the barrel in the path for a really long time, and so he's able to adjust. So it'll be interesting to see what he does. And then, still one of my favorite prospects out of this class, just because he's such a nice kid, is Oliver Service. I was watching some more video, and I ran across one of his Little League World Series bombs that he hit. I was like, oh yeah, I forgot that he absolutely destroyed the ball almost out of the stadium that year. So talking about multi-athlete kids and then this was one of the questions we got the other day was, does Texas only take baseball only kids, or do they like to bring those multi-sport athletes? And I think he's a perfect example of, look, multi-sport athletes are really good because they're not just everyday baseball. They have some agility. They may have some more athletic, gene in them that allows them to really succeed long-term. So,
yeah, I mean, to me, I think, you'll be pretty hard pressed to find a kid that people like more than Oliver. Like everybody you talk to about him just like glows and lights up when his name's brought up. And like you're talking about that multi-sport background. I mean, he's another one, kind of in that part of the country that doesn't get to get on the field as much just simply because of the weather. And I can speak to Coach Pierce's preferences when it comes to the multi-sport thing. Like when I was there, we loved it because, and keep in mind, like Coach Pierce's background himself, having coached football in high school and his family's background in football, obviously, with the Kubiaks. I mean, he's been around it a little bit. And, I think that there's a lot of benefits from kids that play football and other sports, and some of it physically, you learn different lessons, you work different parts of your body. And then mentally, you're not just, there's a real tendency for burnout for some of those kids. Like Dustin and I were kind of in that age group of like guys that were first starting to play nothing but baseball. And when I first started getting on staff, like we had to put a real emphasis. You saw it show up a lot when it came to summer ball. Mainly just, being really mindful of, does it make sense to send this kid out if he's played a lot for us this year, just from a mental standpoint? Like it's, again, some of these kids, they play more year round than some of the college guys and more than the pro guys even, like and they just never get or got a break. And so, the burnout factor was real, and we had to really monitor that. And, I think that from a physical standpoint, like going back to what we just talked about, not saying that these guys are capped out, but a guy like Oliver, he may have a long way to go while already being good, and his athleticism and having played those other sports. I think he played hockey, didn't he?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure he
plays
did,
hockey,
and
football.
Yeah, exactly. And so like that hockey background, we've had a pretty good history of that. Mark Payton was a big hockey player. So really, typically really good hand-eye coordination.
Strong wrist, strong hands.
Yeah. And so like that athleticism, I mean, like, if you have two kids that are equal in the recruiting process, give me the one that has played less baseball all day long. Just because, there's a chance that, there's still a lot more room for development for them. And that's not to disparage anyone that does nothing but baseball, because there's obviously a lot of them that are really good at it and will continue to be. And that's just what they chose to do from an early age. But that's not the best thing for everybody. Right. And, and I think that there's some real, I mean, again, going back to Ian Scheck, like if you believe in your program's development system, like, give me that guy all day long, like an Ian or an Oliver that have some athletic ability and some size, like the stuff that you can't coach. And then be able to mold them. Because a lot of, not a lot of times, but pretty frequently, at least the guys that have done nothing but baseball, it's harder to get them to make adjustments. And that's not because of desire. It's just because it's, if you've had the same hitting coach for 10 years and like that's it takes some time to break down that muscle memory. And it may be a small tweak, but that may take longer for that guy than it does for this guy who has significant amount less swings or reps at a certain skill.
Yeah. So Dustin and, Drew, this was an easy question. I feel like last year's class, in the 2022 class, it was Thomas and Ballou. Those were the two best hitters. From a hitting perspective, one, who do you think is the best hitter out of this group? And then maybe who do you think has the highest upside or projection from the group?
From the freshman group?
Yeah. You go first.
That's a tough one. I know who's got the best projection. And that's Will Gasparino. When you just look at the all-around tools, the swing, like, when he went to the draft combine out in San Diego and started peppering balls all over the place at Chase Field with some big exit velocity, I was like, oh man.
Yeah.
Coach Pierce might hate the draft combine next year, because like that's a guy that's like, he started checking all these boxes of the guy that gets paid over $1 million.
Yeah.
So I was like, oh, they're gonna sweat this one. But I think it turns out that Will just was like, hey man, I want to go develop at college. It's fortunate for Texas. So he's the all-around one. I didn't see this guy in person. No, I saw him in person because he was an area code guy last year, I think. I think Borba probably on the hitting side is probably the most instant impact ready hitter that's going to get to campus. From a swing perspective, Nick Sanders is way up there. It's I just didn't see, I didn't see him or like read about him or watch video of him against like really, really high level stuff. So I don't know how well he can handle that. But if you watch a batting practice or a workout of Nick Sanders swinging the bat, it's really exciting. But for me, all around, it's Gasparino. And I think in terms of instant impact, show up and hit, I'd probably go with Borba.
Yeah, I'd probably agree with those two. But just for sake of conversation, I'm gonna pick two different. But it's tough to ignore. Like, we talked about Casey Borba's background. I mean, he's advanced as a hitter. There's just no two ways about it. But I'm gonna go a little bit different. I'm gonna go like Tommy Farmer. For a projection standpoint, we saw him at a camp last year, and he can really, really run. And based on his listed size on the fall roster at 6'3", 190, he's grown some too. And so like he's a guy that the tools are loud. Like he's a sneaky get that a lot of us aren't talking about. That if things click and he gets in the right system and gets the right amount of chances, I could see him really taking off from a projection standpoint. From a most ready standpoint, I'm gonna
while you're thinking, Tommy Farmer on his profile's got a 6'3", 60, an exit velo of 98, and an outfield throwing velo of 94. So if those are accurate, that's plus run, plus arm, and you'd probably say above average power potential. Like those are really good tools. Like, and like if he's already 6'3", 190, I mean, you've got some upside there.
Yeah, I mean, I saw MJ Sweeney hit some absolute bombs this summer, and I was thinking this is a kid that could come in on like a Tuesday night game against Texas Southern and just, lop a couple over the fence. But yeah, I agree that probably Gaspo with a projection. I think I've heard some maybe concern around just the, he's a tall kid. He's 6'6", 6'7", around just the mechanics of trying to, swing through and having to work on that. But yeah, those are probably the same names I would have come up with as well. So,
yeah. Yeah. Well, one thing, that's been really interesting to me is like, where this 2024 group was at last year from a recruiting standpoint at this time versus right now.
Yeah.
It's a different look for sure. There's been some churn in that class with some decommits and adding some guys, but it's turning into a pretty impressive group on paper. Depending upon which sites you look at and which rankings you look at, that varies, but you can't deny that, there's some major star power in it. They got the recent addition with Sam Richardson, Bryce Rayner is one of the top names. Levi Sterling has turned himself into one of the top names. And then obviously, Theo Gillen from Westlake has always been a huge name in this class, but I think a lot of credit goes to the staff for the work that has gone into this 24 class, because, I think, we even said it at times last year, like it wasn't great, and I mean, it's just, and that's one of the things you have to take into consideration. And baseball's, it's a lot different than football when you're talking about recruiting, but man, it's turned into a really solid class, I think, and some really good players to go along with the stars. Like Carson Luna was a guy that I know Texas had in a camp last fall that Dustin and I saw, but one of our biggest events this year, he was the MVP.
He's blown up this summer for sure.
He has, like, he's turned into a guy that has gone from a guy who's probably gonna not going to get a huge chance right off the bat to a guy that you may not have a chance or a choice but to get on the field sooner rather than later. And it may not be, again, he's kind of one of those guys that might not be at his, where he ends up from a position standpoint, but he just may find his way onto the field offensively just because you have to get him in there. But, some recent additions there. I know we probably don't have time to go through all of the 24 and 25 class, but those two classes combined, I know there's been a lot of work done on that group over the last couple of years. Caleb's done a really good job with them over those 2 years. And the staff as a whole, I mean, they've identified some guys before they really took off, before their names were big out there on the market. And there's a lot of, that's tough to do. There's some teams up here that, DBU is one that we talk about a lot. Like, they have been the kings at like just hitting guys right before they blow up. And seeing us jump on some of those guys when we are, I think is a very good sign of, both, knowing the right people and both, and on top of that, of making confident evaluations. It's not an easy thing to do. And it takes some guts a little bit, but I like where our future classes are headed.
Yeah, as we go into
Cooper Powell and Tyler Walton are good examples of that.
Yeah, for sure.
On the mound.
Well, if you look at the 24-25 class, I think one of the things that stands out to me is not just the work they've done in identifying the, those kind of fringe MLB kids, or like for sure, like, hey, this is a kid that really has a chance. But to your point, like, some of the guys that are a little underrated, and being able to kind of blend the two to really fill out that roster in a way that is really impressive. At one point, the 2024 class looked just abysmal. And, Texas A&M was sitting there with 9 or 10 kids in the top 50. And you're like, what's going on? And they've really turned the narrative around, because the next 2 years, you start looking at the amount of talent. If the 2023 class, which has a ton of depth, you start layering those on, and, people wonder, well, hey, the 2022 season, Texas came out of nowhere and made a super regional. Well, you didn't expect anything from them. Well, you go back, Drew, to your point, when you're recruiting to fill a need instead of just maybe having to go after the 1 or 2 select talents, it makes a big difference.
Well, and I think, one thing that can't be overlooked in what some of the stuff you just said is the NIL component. It may not be a huge thing. And I think, there's a huge misconception of what's really going on from an NIL standpoint. Like, some of the numbers you hear are just absurd and nowhere in the real ballpark of what's actually, getting to these kids. And that's okay, as long as, it's frustrating to see sometimes, because like, it's used inappropriately in recruiting, to get kids to come there, and that when the money's not actually there. So I think that's one thing that Texas fans should be confident of, is that, the group's done a really good job of not only like making it available, but delivering on it. Like, that's stuff that will continue to come out over the next couple of years, when there's some situations that doesn't take place at some other places. But, I think the key component of that is that lets our money stretch from a recruiting standpoint, whether it be NIL or the 11.7, it allows that to stretch a little bit further to go get some guys from out of state. Yeah. And I think that the staff has done a really good job of identifying some of those kind of kids. Like, I know, like, looking at the 24 class currently, 7 of the 19 guys are from out of state. And then in that 25 class, it's 3 of 12 currently. We've had a lot of success in California, and I think there's a number of reasons for that. Like, between Augie and Tulo, I think, people underestimate, the weight that Coach Garrido still carries in the state of California. Like, it's tough to find a high school or a college coach that doesn't have some connection to him still. And like, we see that a lot. Like, there's a young commit. I guess he's in the 26, Murrieta, Brady Murrieta. And his dad's a Fullerton guy, and so like, that name still carries a lot of weight in that state, in our sport. And And then you saw an uptick in it when 2-0 came to Texas. That name just gets you in the door and gets you into some pockets of places that you may not have been involved in before. And on top of that, we always found that going to California helped from an out-of-state standpoint because, the sticker shock of an out-of-state tuition cost or, what you're going to have to pay to go to school, that it's not as dramatic as it is for some people in other parts of the country, just because of the cost of living. So many of these kids go to really expensive private schools already that may actually be more expensive than going to Texas in the long run. And so, I think those are some of the reasons that you've seen us have success in California. But a big credit to the staff. I mean, there's kids from a bunch of different states looking at the group. I mean, everyone saw the recent Hawaii commit. I know Coach Rodriguez has some ties in Hawaii. I think they recruited there when he was at Pepperdine. You got a lot of California. You got a Kansas. You have a guy that got recently from North Carolina, the catcher Ryan Schwartz.
Yeah.
Dipping into Georgia to get Maddox Mansour in the 25 class, who's a dude. Like he's big time. But yeah, I know. I think that's one thing that the success that we've had due to NIL. I think that can't be understated. Just because for that reason, it just allows you. It's tough to go out to another state and spend that kind of money for a guy that wasn't your Friday night starter or your 3-hole hitter. To just be competitive in the scholarship market, it was tough to do because, giving the kid the same amount of scholarship, like an in-state kid, if you paid for their books, tuition, and fees, that would cost you 40% or 0.4 of the 11.7. And whereas if you gave the exact same scholarship to the kid to where they're paying the same as those Texas kids getting that scholarship, it costs us, anywhere between 70 and 80% on that 11.7 scale. So, just having some flexibility afforded to the staff when it comes to NIL, I think is something that plays a factor in that and will continue to. And I think the collective group's done a good job. It's finding ways to do some stuff that makes sense from an NIL standpoint is extremely helpful to the roster and to the depth of the roster moving forward.
This offseason was an interesting one where NIL for the first time in I think recent experience really played a massive part of, hey, we can actually kind of keep this kid at school. LBJ is a great example, right? Like this is a kid that we know is going to be better off with a year in Texas and growing into that body and continuing to work. Because instead of getting 150 or 200 or 300,000, he could maybe look at $1 million in the draft. And so it'll be interesting to see how that also translates.
I think he was looking at a pretty good chunk of change.
Well, he was looking more, but yeah,
from what we heard. So, he'll be a fascinating one. I don't know if passing on the draft and that kind of money, we'll see what it looks like after this year.
Yeah, he was an interesting one for sure. But yeah, looking at the NIL and the opportunities it offers to the high school areas they come into college it's
definitely
right?
Texas is definitely in that arena, whereas I think I'm sure Texas fans got tired of hearing other programs like, there's no doubt it was a factor this offseason, like you said, Zach, and it hadn't, I don't think it truly had been prior to that, when he's talking about the Wits and the LeBarons and, Dylan Campbell went down to the wire. Those types of guys, like it was a part of the discussion, which is what, if you're Texas, that's what you want. You want it to be at least part of the discussion to where there's that element in terms of retaining players and obtaining players.
Yep.
And, credit to those guys. I know that they've been working really hard behind the scenes to make this a part, part of the program. And it has. And I think too, like, if we're going to be honest about the offseason and, some of the coaching changes and things like that, I think a lot of it was geared around recruiting. And I think we're seeing the fruits of those changes already. Like,
For sure.
Getting out, seeing these guys, staying up to date with everything, beating schools to the punch. Like, I think you can say Texas probably beat a lot of people to the punch for Cooper Powell, probably beat a lot of people to the punch for Tyler Walton. You know, like Sam Richardson has huge tools, like massive physical power hitter, like beating guys for them. Like Matt Scott flips his commitment from Oklahoma to Texas. Like you start kind of going down the list, you know, Kaimi, like goes out the area code and is up to 92 miles an hour twice with a quality breaking ball at 6'8". He's a year young for his class. Like that guy had a ton of attention. So you're starting to see already, you know, with, you know, like Caleb Longleg leading the charge from the recruiting coordinator standpoint. You know, we saw Coach Rodriguez on the road a lot this summer. You're starting to see the fruits of kind of a re-energized recruiting approach already playing off in a big way. The 24 class looks a lot better than it did at this point last year. And that 25 class has a chance to be really special.
Yeah, absolutely. So staying on the recruiting philosophy, right? I know that Pierce, even the MLB, right? You look at the draft, it's recruit up the middle because as we talked about earlier, you can move them around, you can shift them. If they can play that spot, very likely they can play other spots at a high or higher level. One of the continuing trends is college arms over prep arms. So from y'all's standpoint, y'all are seeing this every day at the prep level. You know, what's the difference for the college program when you can bring in trios or quads of guys that you know that maybe not 1 year in, but 2 years in are going to make a massive boost to the program?
I could talk for an hour about this. Like I've got it's something I'm like really passionate about. Like it used to be, you know, Zach, you know this now, you live it. When you post a commitment on Orange Bloods, oh, that guy's not going to campus. He's not showing
up. What's the point?
Like,
yeah.
What's the point? Why are you even doing this? You know, like, oh, wake me up in 4 years when he's on campus, which fortunately we don't have to worry about as much anymore with the new recruiting rules.
Yeah.
But things are changing with the draft. And the number one thing that scares organizations to death is a prep right-handed pitcher. Like the track record of the big time investments for those guys in the drafts in recent years has not worked. Like if you go back and look at first round right-handed pitchers drafted out of high school, and of the non-freak Hunter Greens of the world, good luck finding a lot of guys that were just successful picks there. It's just not a good track record. And you know, the thing that organizations pay attention to the most now is past history. What is past history telling us about the draft? Now, I think there's an element of maybe those teams weren't drafting the right guys in the past, which they've learned, like, hey, the mature, strong 98 mile an hour, that's like a bulky guy that doesn't have much physical projection. Those guys don't work out long term. Well, if you're going to spend $4 million on them. So there's that element too, but it's like the past history has told them, hey, right-handed pitchers from high school early on in the draft, not good investments. But, you know, if you get to the second round, the third round, so on and so on. 5 years ago, there's zero chance Travis Sikora ever lasts to the second round or the third round. Zero. None. Oh, tall 6'6" right-hander from Texas that throws 100. Yeah. First round. Sign him up. It's done. Yeah. So things have kind of changed. And I think Texas fans need to recalibrate how they think about recruiting commitments, because more so than ever before, we're seeing kids go to college. And there's a lot of factors for that. Part of it's the draft. Part of it's the, you know, from a draft perspective, you eliminate a lot of your risk as an organization when you take a college player, because you've seen them against quality competition for multiple years. You've probably seen them in the Cape Cod League or the Northwoods League or the California Collegiate League. Maybe you've seen them on Team USA. In the future for Texas, you're going to see them go through the SEC grind where they're facing really high-level pitching day in, day out, really high-level position players. So you eliminate a lot of that risk. So the agents and the advisors and even the high school kids have kind of caught on, like, well, if the draft is drafting all these college guys and paying them money, let's set these really high price tags to where if you get it, great, you'll sign, you'll go pro. If not, you'll go to school and have an opportunity to make that money. Now, I do think there's instances where the advisors err and they set these really high price tags for guys that are kind of boomer bust prospects. It's like, you got to understand, if you go to college, you've got to be better than everybody on your roster, in your conference, You've got to go perform in a summer league, and then maybe you've got to compete with all these guys on Team USA. And oh, by the way, there's these really good JUCO players as well. So the amount of guys that get over $1 million in the draft, people have this idea sometimes. It's like, oh, we operate like there's 100 guys that get that much money. There's not. But I think like recruiting now, I think is more important than ever because of the NIL component, which Texas is making big strides in. But also too, you can get more of these guys on campus now. Like, there are very few times you're going to have a recruiting class where you're going to lose a bunch of guys to the draft anymore. You might lose one or two, but you're going to get a lot of these guys now, even the high level guys that had zero shot of going to college prior to. A lot of those guys are going to end up on campus. So, with the prep pitchers, they go to college, like, it's just, we see it. We go see a lot of these guys in high school in the summer. Like, you don't really know. Like, you can project and the feel for the stuff and spin, but how good of a competitor is he? How well can he hold his stuff? Like, can he actually command it? Like, a lot of times these guys, if they throw 92, 93, are just going to blow it by everybody. What's the fastball shape like? So by these guys going to college, a lot of those questions get answered, good or bad, but a lot of those questions get answered. Which is why it sometimes benefits the projectable arm to go to college and really project and click. And it benefits the scout somewhere. We're just not sold on this guy. Let's see what he looks like in 3 years.
Yeah. I feel like from the minor league perspective also, you see those guys coming out of college that, they took the time to develop. You see them progressing a lot faster too. It's not like, hey, you're going to languish here. You're going to move up. If you're performing, you are going forward. And so it gives that better perspective instead of, sorry, you're going to sit here for 3 years because we have to tweak your mechanics or work on something. And then, then if you are consistently performing, then you get a chance. So yeah, it's interesting. One of the other questions we got, it was, and I think this is a really interesting one, right? Because there's certainly different philosophies, but do coaches prioritize pitchers over position players? And part of me was like, well, yeah, of course you do, right? Like, you can find hitters everywhere. You can't always find a guy that can get strikeouts or throw strikes. And then I started taking it back. Yeah, that's not always the case, but it has to be the case, right? Like, a pitcher's always going to have more value. You see them get paid more for the most part. So I don't know. What are y'all's thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I mean, like, there's an art to it. Like, that's the one thing that I think that this staff brought that is more organized than what we were in the past. And as a result, like, I think it makes sense to have in your mind, at least a certain amount of scholarship allocated to the pitching, to the catching, kind of like Dustin said. Like, there's there's premium positions that you have to get right or you're just not going to be very good. And so I think that, I mean, if I don't think you find many teams that just can't pitch that go very far. Whereas on the flip side, like, you can be a team that doesn't score a lot of runs and still have a successful playoff run. Right. Yeah. And so, the prevalence of prioritizing pitching, it's out there, I mean, like, and it makes sense why. I think it's a lot easier. You have a better chance of winning if you're better on the mound, and okay offensively versus the opposite. So I think that it goes a long way, but it is interesting. Like, it's different than the draft. Like, I think that people view recruiting, how you build a roster for college, a lot differently. There's some similarities certainly, but I think if you're recruiting for college, you have to, in most cases, if at the top places, you have to have a lot more ready-made guy, right? Like, like, we never had the luxury to just throw a guy out there and let him fail because you lose on a Tuesday. I mean, like, you're getting everyone's best on a Tuesday. And that's one of the biggest adjustments I think there always is for freshmen at Texas is like, hey, you look at the schedule and you see XYZ state and think, oh, okay, we're Texas, we should roll over them. But in reality, in this part of the country, all of those teams can beat you, and so, like, that's a real that's a tricky, that's one thing that Coach Pierce has been really good at since he's been at Texas, is winning those Tuesday games.
Yes. Yeah.
And that comes at a cost, like that may mean using more of your frontline guys versus just, being in a setting like pro ball in the minor leagues or some junior college scenarios where you may have a guy that has all the talent in the world, but he's just not ready yet. And you can just keep throwing him out there. You don't have that luxury at this level play. So, I think, hitting's hard. And I think it's easier to find good pitching too. Like, I think it's easier to look at guys on the pitching side and have a feeling that they're going to be pretty good. It's easier to project, I think, a guy going from high school to college having success on the mound than it is hitters, just because hitting's so hard. Yeah. And a swing at one level of baseball doesn't always translate to the next level, right? There's some guy, and that's why Ivan Melendez is a second round pick versus a top 10 pick, which was what his production warranted, right?
Yeah.
You see a lot of guys that just like, hey, does this guy have a metal bat swing? Is it gonna translate to wood? So I think it's easier to find those the pitching ones. Now, I don't know if there's as many of them, but it's easier to find them, if that makes sense, I think.
Yeah, I always feel like you can always tell an elite pitcher and project that success versus maybe an elite hitter and try to project down the road. How does he adjust from aluminum to metal, or from aluminum to wood, and facing more and more elite pitching? It's always tough. So
I know. Go ahead, Dustin.
I was gonna say, like, I had a scout, a long time scout, told me, like, when you're evaluating hitters and pitchers, like with pitchers, it matters who they're facing, but it doesn't necessarily matter because stuff is stuff. Like you can see stuff. Yeah. It doesn't matter if they're facing the 6A juggernaut or a 3A whatever. Like, it's still stuff. Like Drew said, with hitters, like, we just don't know. Like, you don't know until they get out there and do it. Like, truly how they process, truly what the swing's like, truly, can they impact the baseball at that level? Truly, can they handle stuff day in and day out? Like you just don't until they show up. But stuff is stuff when you see it.
Yeah. So one of the other questions we had was around the catcher position. Texas has had quite a few big names come through, and they've had a lot of success there. But do you look for more of a defensive catcher that has a little bit of a projection, or do you look for an offensive guy that you can train to be defensive? I think you could go a lot of different directions, and it's going to be split half and half. I feel like a catcher that can hit has a lot more value because you can potentially teach him how to catch, but that doesn't mean you can teach him how to run a game, control a game, help the pitcher, be that, defensive general on the field. So I don't know. What are y'all's thoughts on that?
Me personally, I don't care if my catcher hits 0. Like, if he can catch, if you and that's why catching recruiting is so difficult. Like, some of the guys at the top of our list when it comes to rankings,
you don't even know. You don't really know.
Yeah,
just don't.
Cade Aaron Beatty was the best hitter at area code from a production standpoint 2 weeks ago, and he's the the number one guy in Texas for us, just like Blake Mitchell was this past year. And they can do stuff defensively. Like, both of those guys can really throw, but there's still questions for them as if they can really catch. And I'll tell you, man, it is, having a guy that can't catch is debilitating for your team, not just the position. Dustin mentioned the year that we had issues, like when DJ got hurt and the McCann, and then, the trickle down effect of having a bad catching is so, it's huge. That crushed the development. Not having guys that could catch that year crushed the development of some of our young pitchers. Like a guy Cam Fields, for example, his best pitch was his slider, and he couldn't throw it with confidence. And like that just totally, in my opinion, stunted his development. And, and it's nobody's fault because of the injuries, but like that's realistic. And, I mean, when we took Silas, most people questioned the bat, but it was like, who cares? Like this guy.
Like the report was good catch and throw guy, and it's like, all right, there you go. Like let's start there. I mean,
the benefits and the hidden benefits that come from having a guy that can really catch and, like you said, run the game and control the running game, like it shows up in so many ways that aren't necessarily in the box score maybe, but like I'll promise you, like that year that we couldn't catch, I mean, and especially we've been spoiled from a long list of really good catchers that ended up playing in the big leagues. I mean, you go from having, Ryan Hubel to Curtis Thigpen, Taylor Teagarden, Rupp, Tress, and these are guys that go on to play in the big leagues. And then like you get in a situation where you just really can't catch, like it is a helpless feeling. Because it affects the whole operation of your team and the flow of the game and the frustration of the pitching and the coaching staff, just it touches everything. So I think, my answer is easy. Like if you told me a guy was a plus catcher defensively and he was going to hit 0, I would take that all day over a guy that was going to produce offensively and not be able to handle the pitching.
Because like if you're doing this right, you have 8 other guys in your lineup that are supposed to be able to hit.
True. Very true.
On your roster, all those 8 other guys can't catch. So you like give me the guy with the receiving, the catch and throw, can handle the run game, and like if he hits, that's an added bonus. But like Drew said, I think Texas fans, I remember covering pitchers and catching situations like that in the past where it never really clicked how much of a detriment that was to pitchers and how demoralizing that is for them, for the team. I mean, it's just like Drew said, the perfect word. It's helpless. Like, because the guy behind the plate's trying. It's just not, the skill's not there. So yeah, give me the defender every single time and twice on Sunday.
Yeah, even looking back at this past season, Ryland's a young guy. He sat behind Blake Mitchell to some extent in high school and maybe probably didn't have as many reps. And I asked Pierce about that as well. And he's like, no, we know the program he came from with Coach Alanese, but, really showed up where I think he had like 25 runners in a row where he couldn't get him out on the base pass. And you could see the pitching, the defense react to that. It does take a toll. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So one of the other questions we had that came in was about the Big 12. What are you going to miss the most and miss the least as Texas enters, or starts to enter that final swan song of, I know they have 2 more seasons, right? But from a baseball perspective, we're starting to see the end of the light of the tunnel of the Big 12.
Yeah, miss the most. Man.
That short bus trip to Baylor. I mean,
yeah, I mean the ease of travel for the most part. That would probably be like from an operational standpoint for sure. I mean, there wasn't. I don't know. It wasn't. There's not a ton of hostile crowds. I'll say the thing I'll miss the most. This is not everyone's opinion, but I actually kind of like, I don't want to say but I didn't mind going to Manhattan, Kansas. Just because there was one little restaurant, this little breakfast spot, like right by the hotel.
It had to be food related.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I would say that. I mean, I think it's called the Chef in Manhattan, Kansas. It was right down
there you go
by the hotel that we stayed at. So I would say that, and I'd be remiss if I didn't say going to the Skirvin in Oklahoma City where we stayed for. I calculated it up one time because we would stay there every single year for the Big 12 tournament.
Yeah.
And then every time we played OU, we would stay in Oklahoma City as opposed to Norman, and we mainly because of the hotel and the Skirvin. And we always, and it's famous for being haunted, right? You can Google it. There's all kinds of stories, and like we had players and staff members that like every year that had some sort of experience with ghosts. With I think her name was Ellie the ghost. But it's the NBA hotel. A lot of the visiting NBA teams stay there too.
Yeah.
And like there's a lot of famous NBA players that like refuse to stay there because of it. But so I'll miss the Skirvin. That's one thing that I would say. As far as things that you're looking forward to the most, I think it's just the atmospheres of the SEC parks. I mean, like, we're hated everywhere we go, as evidenced by Brett Yormark yesterday. But the intensity of every single game, and that's going to be one of the biggest challenges too. But I think, for a program like Texas, it should be one of the most exciting things, and it should help in recruiting. Like, get to say, hey, I'm going to Baton Rouge to play against LSU. Hey, I'm going to Ole Miss. No, not a single. We went to Ole Miss for the Super Regional my freshman year, and I was spoiled because not a single place that we ever played after that anywhere even came close to that atmosphere that we faced in that Super Regional. It was incredible. And, just the towns, different types of towns in the SEC, really, really good ballparks. I think that the travel will be much more difficult. I'll say that, but it, makes up for itself with the atmosphere and the venues and the intensity of the crowd. It's, that's the thing. There's some places in the Big 12 that even on their best day would be the worst fan turnout in the SEC. And so, there's some of that. So that'll be an adjustment. And, I think from a competition standpoint, like, this was my opinion of Coach Schlossnagle at A&M as well, is like one of the things that I was most intrigued to see when he moved to A&M was, we know he's a good coach. There was no questioning that, but you didn't know, let's be realistic. If you're a top 2 or 3 team in the Big 12 and a favorite to win the league, you should not lose 2 weekends in a row. And in the SEC, you're going to lose 2 weekends in a row at some point. It's just, even the national championship teams in that conference do that. And having the mental ability as a staff, as players, to overcome that and be able to turn the page is huge. Because if you can't do that, it's going to, and Rob Childress learned that when A&M first went to the SEC, he was notoriously hard on his team, just in general, but even more so when they lost. And I've heard him say it to people, and I know people in that program, like he had to change his approach to it to have some success there, because you're going to beat yourself up to the point of no return if you can't turn the page. And I think that'll be for the team specifically, that will be one of the biggest adjustments, because if you lose on Sunday, guess what? You got another top 10 team, or you may be going to another top 10 team to play the next weekend. So you better figure out a way to turn the page.
Yeah, I think for me, the least likely thing, or the thing I'm least looking forward to in the SEC is those Thursday through Saturday series instead of having Friday through Sunday. I get it, but man, it makes it tough.
Well, that'll be a benefit on the travel side. Like the players will miss more school, but they'll also feel on the back end like they get a little bit more of a break. Like I could tell you, like, that Easter weekend, when we always did Thursday through Sunday, like there's some logistical challenges, but man, just like having a day to take a breather, as a fan too, I like the Thursday through Saturday because it gives you something to do on Thursday night. But and you don't have to be glued, spend a whole nother weekend day eating up your time watching the game. If you're someone that watches all the games, like you might give yourself a weekend day off too. So.
Yeah. Very true.
Zach, you just got to prepare yourself, because your subscriber base no matter how many times you try to tell them, is going to complain about strikeouts and hitting when Texas goes to the SEC. And the reality is that there could be conference seasons where you see on Friday night either a first round pick in that year's draft or a first round pick in the coming up draft, or heck, you might go and just it might be every weekend series.
Yeah,
there's one of those guys on the mound. So the talent level is going to be, it might shock some people, but it's going to be really fun to watch because there's going to be mega household names in competition every single conference series. It's from a spectator standpoint, which is going to be really, really fun. And Drew said the atmospheres, and I don't think I'll miss anything really about the Big 12 besides the Tech and TCU Texas series were turning into must-watch, charged attractions, like just great competitiveness, great energy, great rivalry, kind of that good animosity. But besides that, I mean, I don't think I'm not gonna lose any sleep over those Big 12 seasons.
So final question before we get out of here. I know I've kept y'all a long time, but what are the 3 things y'all are looking for, what fans should be looking for from this team? Because the makeup of this team is a little bit different, right? They've got quite a few returning pieces, and those are pieces really have somewhat solidified their positions in a lot of ways. So, you know, what do you want to take away from this fall as we get deeper in?
Do you want to go, Dustin, you want to go 3 at a time, or do you want to alternate here?
I'll go through 3 really quick. Okay. Just the competition of the position players in the fall, because there's a lot of talent at a lot of positions, and I think that's a good thing. But just who emerges from that, and particularly like what does shortstop look like? What does the middle infield look like? There's a lot of really talented outfielders. How does that outfield shake up with some guys moving on? But to me, the single biggest thing about the fall is going to be on the pitching side, because they've got to they need some stuff. They need some stuff on the mound. What does Tanner Witt look like? Coming back from Tommy John, it was a lot more rocky than smooth. So what does that look like in the fall? LeBaron Johnson kind of went from a not completely unknown, but kind of a reliever to, oh my gosh, this guy has good stuff in the midweek, to a dude at the end of the season. How does he handle that workload coming back from that? What does it look like now with expectations for him? That's something he hasn't really dealt with before, but really where's the pitching going to come from? That to me is the biggest question of the fall. And then, the third one is kind of an easy one, but this new coaching staff dynamic, the way the coaching staff shifted around, a lot of guys are back, but some other new guys are in different roles, and how does that all shake out in the development side? And I think infielders are going to benefit enormously from Troy Tulowitzki being back. But what does the hitting look like? What does the pitching look like with Coach Pierce and Coach Gordon kind of teaming up to run that now? But really is who is going to pitch on this team? They've got to have some impact arms, or it could be an up and down season for them.
Yeah. I'll try to say some different stuff, but I want to see what Jalen Flores looks like. From year 1 to year 2. Again, going back to Tulo, having Tulo in the building should help him a lot. Obviously in his new role, Tulo can't coach, but his presence and just being there to bounce stuff off, I think should be huge for Jalen if he wants to get better. And that I think is going to be a big storyline. Just because on paper, he should be the answer at shortstop. And you talk about the premium positions, Jalen, what happens there at shortstop? Going back to the catching, I think Ryland's the pretty clear favorite to be the starting catcher there, but what happens behind him? Who's in those roles behind him, and how can it be good enough to spell Ryland some, give him some breaks throughout the season. So those two spots, and then I think, it's, Dustin talked about the competition, but there's going to be some good players that aren't playing a lot this year. And how that shakes out, there's a lot of good players to choose from. The depth is going to be a thing. And figuring out who are going to be the real contributors and where is going to be interesting to me. I always like the new guys. That was always fun for me because I've always been a recruiting junkie. So and spent a lot of time helping with the recruiting efforts when I was on staff. So getting and back when I was on staff, like my role, I wasn't able to go out and watch the guys. So that added element of, hey, I get to see these guys up close and playing and moving around versus just seeing video and listening to what the coaches are bringing back. But I'm always fascinated by the new shiny toys. So and I think there's some real potential critical pieces for this year's roster if they want to go and be in Omaha where they belong. So from a program standpoint. So I think that's interesting. I'm Houston Street back as a student assistant.
Yeah,
will be forever entertaining. Talking about the staff, a guy, and I know everyone's familiar with the coaching staff, but a guy that a lot of people that follow it really closely know, but Chris Gordon, I think his role with the staff and role with the team is something that can't be overlooked because, let's be realistic, Coach Pierce is the head coach and he's the pitching coach. Yeah. And, it would be a lot tougher job for him to be the pitching coach without a guy like Chris there to manage some of the day-to-day things that a pitching coach would normally do that doesn't take place on the field. His background, his strengths and, evaluating and analytics and all that, and his input in the staff and the direction of the program is big. I think the support staff, obviously I pay attention to that because I was a part of it and know how much goes into that. And it's really good. Carly moving into that director of operations role will be good for everybody. She's good at everything she does, and she's a key component of the entire program. We have one of the best strength coaches in America in Matt Couch. I think that's something that gets overlooked. Like his abilities there and background and regimen and demeanor is something that can't be overstated. And it's a very good staff. So from top to bottom, not just the coaching staff. So those are things that are, I think, play a huge role in the success of the team.
Yeah, for me, it was how does the outfield come together? Porter Brown's going to lock down left field, but where does a guy like Max Ballou, who kind of, he has a good bat, he kind of showed that off in the California League. Questions maybe on defense still. What does that look like potentially in right field? And then, is it Gaspo in center field or Ace Whitehead? Like they've got a lot of different options. They could even roll out, Duplantier, the baby Duplantier out there, right? And then for me, I think Dustin touched on it, is who's going to pitch and what is it going to look like? Because there were some moments where, Witts looked really good. There's been moments that have been really, really rocky, and he's missing 4 or 5 ticks on the velo, and that puts a little more pressure on your breaking ball, which has looked good. But what does the command look like? And I think the workload and expectations a bit about LBJ is really important because, you talk about the nicest, quietest, just unassuming guy, and that's LBJ. And then, there's going to be a lot of pressure on him to go repeat a Miami performance, and that's not what they need every single time out.
Right. Yeah.
But, what do they do from a left-hand perspective? And then I guess one of the big things for me is roster management. Drew, you mentioned they've got a ton of depth. There's a lot of people on this roster going into the fall, and how does that shake out?
48 guys. There's
like
20 and 26 new players on the roster.
Yeah. They brought in pretty much their entire freshman class, which doesn't always happen at Texas. So how that all shakes out and what the depth looks like is going to be really, really interesting. There's going to be some tight battles. So
yeah, no doubt.
Well, gents, I know I've kept y'all a long time. I appreciate the time as always. It's always good to catch up and hear what y'all are seeing on the road and what y'all are up to. So appreciate the insights.
Yeah, of course.
Looking
Yeah,
forward to doing it
thanks for
again.
having us. Good to catch up. Been a while.
Yeah, it's been too long. So
yeah,
I got Mike Rooney coming in pretty soon to talk about the state of baseball in general.
Oh,
so
the Runes.
nice.
That'll be a good one.
Yeah, that'll be a
awesome.
really good one. So looking forward to that. But again, thanks y'all. And make sure to check out Orange Bloods for all the college baseball. Make sure you check out 5 Tool for all the coverage. And yeah, have a good one.